AI in diagnostics. Are we there yet?
So hello, I'm Thomas Balkizas from AWS, Amazon Web Services. It's a pleasure to be here. First time in Malta. Thank you to our distinguished doctors for inviting and organizing this. And I really enjoyed some of the early discussions. So we're hoping to take this a step further. We're going to talk about diagnostics and AI. I'm going to start with Charles, simply because he's to my right. And a few years back, I was working for another AI and cloud computing company. And I did a presentation much like here, and the young radiologist, like Ryan, came to me and said, Thomas, is this going to eat my lunch? And I'm not going to divulge what I replied back then, but I would like to get your opinion on it. Is AI, machine learning, going to take away the livelihoods of radiologists all across the world? Charles Donnelly. First of all, introduce yourself.
Absolutely. So it's great to be here. Great to be here at the first in-person MedTech conference. Came all the way from the United States. I'm COO of Neurothink with my partner Brian Rogers, who's CEO. And short answer is no. Technology has always advanced in medicine. This is another tool along with telemedicine, and fundamentally, things have moved on from filtering to making relationships between parameters, and now pattern recognition as you get into deeper neural nets. You still have to know what they do, and you still have to be able to put the knowledge back into them and then put them back into the hands of doctors. And so you will always have the practitioners, and this will be another tool that they use.
Michel, same question. Introduce yourself. We're going a little bit unconventionally today, but go on.
Thank you very much. Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Michel Bieleski. I'm the CEO of Testasy. We're a remote diagnostics platform that is currently focusing on COVID. And I'm also a postdoctoral researcher at the University Hospital Zurich. And to answer that question, I'm not a radiologist, but I have been in the field of telemedicine for a bit. And I've brushed shoulders with a lot of people who are in the AI field. And before having this panel discussion here today, I talked to two heads of radiology in Switzerland because I just wanted to know their opinion as well. I was curious, like, hey guys, where are we? And this is not the first time I'm on a panel like this. And usually when you talk about AI, especially amongst doctors, you have a lot of skepticism because they sort of have the feeling that suddenly they won't have the authority anymore to do anything, or that that they will be redundant, their function will be redundant. And I think the truth is very far away from that. And to answer your question specifically, I think that AI will just help us making better clinical decisions. It's a bit like an autopilot for pilots. Like, imagine a pilot who comes and is like, guys, I am good enough. I have 20 years of experience. I do not need the autopilot. I mean, I would not board that plane.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Michel. I'm going to come on to you, Ilja. Maybe just to expand on the answers we've already had.
Sure.
Is it perhaps, instead of putting these two aspects one against the other, do you see potentially a more synergistic approach between doctors, and not just in radiology, but let's talk about diagnostics since we've got in this topic?
Sure, because first of all, about myself, I'm Ilja Radlgruber from Austria, CEO of Pantaflow, former radiologist and now strategic consultant for digitization in healthcare with a lot of focus on AI. And
you said former radiologist, there's a hint.
Yes,
perhaps.
I'm not working now as a radiologist, but I have seen it live in practice. And what can I say? When we ask the question, will AI replace the doctors? It's a really big promise. From today, maybe next year, 5 years, is it really possible to replace? No, definitely no. This is can be said with no. But I think it's interesting to look at not where we are now, but how far we have come. For example, 3 or 4 years ago, if we look at specific breast cancer, for example, AI was about 80% specificity and sensitivity, which means only 4 out of 5 patients were diagnosed with breast cancer. This was 4 years ago. And now, last year, there was a Nature study which shows that diagnosis capability of AI has surpassed minimal percentage, 2 to 5%, the capabilities of the doctors, which means we have come a far way in these 4 years. And if we not only look at, as you said, could there be symbiosis? And I can say definitely yes, there can be symbiosis. We can go forward into detail.
Great. Thank you. Thanks. I'm going to come back to Charles. We're going around and say we found our footing now. So, Charles, think of a case where perhaps we're trying to triage. You know, we have a situation where, especially after COVID, there are a number of queues. You know, back where I live in London, there's NHS hospitals where we simply cannot see the patients quickly enough. And now they come to you and say, Charles, you know, can you put together an ML algorithm so we can choose who we're going to see first? You know, do you see AI perhaps being used in a sense of in a triage and in a way of prioritizing perhaps who gets to be seen first?
Yeah, great. There are a number of use cases for machine learning, and something like that. There are examples of that. There are also limitations of that. So if you go in the United States, the military, one of the largest organizations collecting data, they have 850 million scans that they can go do ML on. They also have patient data from the time you're 19 until you retire out of the military. They're building those type of algorithms to help suggest, or even early on, to be able to track COVID before you knew what it was. So machine learning being able to do a number of things. One of them is to identify a signal nobody knows about yet. But the other piece is just to codify knowledge and then be able to push that knowledge out to where the decision needs to be made with the doctor. I think that the last step I just talked about is the first place that machine learning can be broadly adopted across the doctor space. That can include looking at images, it can include looking at health records that are maybe not fully accurate yet and flagging those, and it can include helping to cut down queue times. We see that throughout the entire supply chain, and I think there's some interesting data sets from places like in the US, Moffitt Cancer Center or Mayo Clinic, where they're using that in order to be more efficient with health education.
Great, thank you. And maybe, Michel, if you want to add to that, or maybe give us a perspective of, where are the limitations in terms of the state of the art of technology, and then maybe, we want to come a bit into what might be on some people's minds, which is what's the framework for using this? Because just to Charles's point, I'm very excited by this prospect, but similarly, some of the patient groups express some concern about this. But let's start from the technology and then move on to regulatory.
I find this an incredibly difficult question to answer because based on what would this triage system work? Would it be computer vision? So does it just look who looks distressed and the most distressed person goes first? Or would we actually be able to connect somehow to the patient data and based on maybe previous diseases and ailments that they have, create some sort of risk score that would say like, well, look, this person here in the middle, he might not look distressed, but actually has the highest risk score out of everybody here to be in emergency. And that goes into big data, it goes into people's data, and it goes into electronic healthcare record systems. And I think on that front, we are nowhere in Europe. Like, there's in most places, you have so many redundancies, even in one single hospital, when it comes to examinations and patient data, when going from one department to another, because there's no interconnection, no interoperability. So what you just asked me is a Nobel Prize question, I think. It's incredibly complex to build a system because it would have to rely on a very solid foundation that comes first, and that is not there.
Well, you heard it here first, so perhaps we can share that Nobel Prize. I would be in very good company if that were the case. Perhaps coming into Ilja, and you've worked, and you said you're a former radiologist, but I would say once a radiologist.
Yes.
Was a radiologist.
Yes.
Perhaps in this example, I would say, maybe to your point, the criteria I don't have. We can, maybe make some assumptions. Just looking at the scans we just discussed about breast screening or breast cancer, which of these 5,000 images do I look at first? Who do I need to call first? But I think you're touching a very important point, which is the reason why this is a difficult question to answer, which is what happens with both the false positives and the false negatives, especially in things like prostate and breast cancer, where you will inevitably have a little bit of noise. And would you be comfortable defending this technology that helps you save time in front of unfortunately, in some cases, a court of law that says, did you or did you not know, Dr. Radlgruber, sorry, I murdered your last name, that this patient could have had cancer, and you chose to listen to an algorithm that said probably not.
And that's the interesting part where you ask about symbiosis, where doctors and AI can be in symbiosis. You said about 5,000 pictures, roundabout, say you need about 10,000 pictures to make a good AI model, which will be relevant for the real world. But 5,000 is also possible. And another question, what of this 5,000, if I have 5,000 patients, what I look first? And that's the positive impact AI could have. If I have a full emergency room and I have a couple of 10, 15, 50, 60 patients in the waiting room, an AI can immediately sort out which patients with a really high probability are normal cases. And if I know as a doctor, these are normal cases, and with approximately 100% accuracy, then I have more time to look at the abnormal cases, because I need more time to look at the specific. Sometimes I need to talk to other doctors if there's a special case. And this would be a huge benefit if around about only 10% of all images, chest x-rays, mammograms, etc., are reduced, and you could allocate these resources, the doctor has more time. This will be a huge benefit. And maybe what's also to say is important is that not all doctors will welcome it with open hands. Why? Because I take the decision, I am a trained doctor, I am trained to have a lot of knowledge and practice, and now a machine makes the decision for me, and I'm skeptical because there's a black box. I don't know how the decision is made. And I have to trust it, and also very important, this depends on which country and which regulations, how's the legal aspect, am I reliable? Or is the AI reliable if this is misdiagnosed? And these are important questions which need to be solved.
Yeah. Excellent, thank you. Thank you, Ilja. Just staying on the same topic, which I don't want to labor too much, but I think it is part of what we're here to do. How do you bring technology into a healthcare system that, at least in my experience in Europe, it takes something like 17 years to bring new innovation into a hospital, at least by NHS standards. How do you bring it? And bring it in a way that A, it's accepted, and B, it's accepted in a way that doesn't destroy things that we've achieved, like quality and security and safety for patients.
Yeah, exactly. So I think Michael brought up a very good point about having the base foundation, right? An image doesn't tell everything about the patient. What's the history? What's the progression? What are the other factors, right? Removing those environmental factors and variables out, and that variance, and then saying I'm left over with this remainder, what are we going to look at? So if they're looking at biomarkers, for example, right? How do you go explain, and they've found many attempts to find something to signal Parkinson's, and then every time they do a more detailed study, it falls apart. There's a lot of data out there. Having data prepared to go into machine learning is a big issue. The next question then is trusting, first of all, not trusting, but having the doctors steer what human-related variables are used to, right? So is it smoking or is it your zip code in the United States, right? Zip code can explain a lot of things, and the neural net doesn't know. So you really need to start with what is your plan to go answer the question? What do you want to do? And then I think to be able to start building this trust, it's about not trying to make the final diagnosis, but trying to inform. of what's already known and already accepted, and then make that standard, and then build and retrain and push it back out to the doctors and keep making it better, and then keep connecting each of those pieces that are helping to inform.
Thank you, Charles. Michel, is that your experience as an entrepreneur and as a founder, and having worked in this space for some time? Is your experience that we've gone from quite a lot of data to maybe getting a little bit smarter about the models, and the reception and the acceptance of these in clinical care?
I think the last two words you said, reception, acceptance, those are the key words. I think that the pandemic is a beautiful thing that happened in terms of for the digital MedTech market in general, to push technology forward. Most of the technology right now on the market has been around for 10 years plus. And there's a beautiful McKinsey paper showing that right after the pandemic hit Europe and the US, the use of telemedicine went up by 40-fold. And there's a huge parabolic curve, and then it normalized it at around 30x level. And now if I ask around my friends and family and whatnot, a big percentage of them had some telemedical consultation. Suddenly everybody knows what Zoom is. My grandma knows what Zoom is, and like 3 years ago, everybody just heard about Skype. So now you can tell a patient like, hey, we're going to do the next consultation via Zoom. There's no need for you to travel to me. And now this is a common standard. People understand it. And I think the same thing will slowly, or I hope not slowly, happen in the AI field. People will, there is a huge lack of awareness. And I want to go into something else. Last year, 143 devices were approved by the FDA that have some sort of ML background. And only 4 of those are based on a randomized clinical study. So very little research gets pushed from we're building a model to we're actually applying it in medicine. Why is that? A vast majority of my colleagues have neither in med school nor after med school have had any touch points with AI or those kind of technologies. So it's very difficult for them to in any way integrate those technologies into their clinical research. And that's where I see the main problem.
Maybe a follow-up question to that, Michel, because you brought up telemedicine, telehealth, and you're right, it has been around for a long period of time. I think even I saw some of the early studies and maybe population health studies in Italy around long-term conditions, but maybe specifically to teleradiology. So the idea, I remember one case where the last 2 oncologists left an area in South Africa, KwaZulu-Natal, and this is an area that's about 10 million of population. So no more state oncologists in this country. And at the time, the question was, can we get some help, one? And is the solution to bring another radiologist remotely and send them the images? Or, should we have a different approach? Now, there was some difficulty in terms of regulating this, because if you're going to be seeing the scans of a patient population in South Africa, you need to be approved by this country, right? So what's your take on this? Do you see that we will have perhaps almost a marketplace where you can do telehealth and teleradiology, and you won't have necessarily to rely on doctors that were trained in your country?
I think that is an excellent topic to talk about. I know specifically about a Japanese startup who's doing exactly that in Africa. They are doing it in ophthalmology, so they have those little devices, they put them on a phone, people get to take images, it's going first to an AI algorithm, and then you get matched with a doctor. And the same thing, I think that's a big misconception. AI does not need to be better than a radiologist. It needs to be better than your average doctor, and it is way better than your average doctor. It is like by far better right now. Like I've been in med school for 6-7 years. I've worked for a few years. Like, please, I prefer AI to take over than me, because I really suck at diagnosing images. So I see that the regulation is a big problem, and I don't have an answer to that, because honestly, I'm battling with that in Switzerland as well. On one hand, countries take the stance of we are a digital nation, we want to be on the forefront of digitization, and at the same time, they put stones in it, like they make it very difficult to actually adapt those technologies.
Yeah. Thank you, Michel. I think it's perhaps there's no right or wrong answer. Maybe I'll open it to to the audience who I cannot see because the lights are quite strong, but you're there. I can see some shadows. If anyone has a question, yeah, hello. Please, someone get them a microphone. Would like to hear from them. Until then, Ilja, maybe just to come back to you on this. So, if it isn't so straightforward, you know, what would you say are some practical steps that, well, a government healthcare is mostly state-funded can take? And what would you say to patients or citizens that are, you know, they have to consider a future whereby these two things have to somehow work? You know, the genie's not going to get back in the bottle. And we're certainly not producing enough radiologists or doctors that can do very complex healthcare.
Convincing them that AI is a good thing in medicine? Or?
I wouldn't put it in those terms, but that wouldn't be something that I wouldn't try to do in a dinner if I was invited, and perhaps to be disinvited from the next one. But in the sense that, you know, if we're in Malta here, and Malta strives to be, as you say, one of the digital innovation hubs of Europe and beyond, what would you advise them that they do when it comes to that? Not specific to teleradiology, but diagnostics is a good place to start.
Well, I would say one of the most important parts is data collection, to have really lean data. And you have a lot of unstructured data, and it's very easy to collect normal cases. For example, if we stay at the case for breast cancer, it's easy to get images of normal patients who have no breast cancer. But if you want to collect abnormal cases, and you need in order that the AI can train on it and diagnose it correctly afterwards. And also, it's the same thing for everything else in AI, in medicine and our industry. Because, just to give an example, breast cancer is the most prevalent disease for women. And for 1,000 women, there are only a couple of cases of breast cancer. And then you have to distinguish between different age, different region, different breast density, and so on. And then you have different modality. Is it MRI? Is it CT? And then you have a variety of different data. But if you want to have an AI model and AI that have a very high accuracy, this has to be very comparable. And so if you say what the government should do and what should be done to foster the progress in AI, as I said, it's very costly to have structured, lean data, to invest more money, more resources to clean the data, which means annotation of images, for example, in radiology, labeling. This is very time intensive. The people who do the job, they are specialists, they have high rates, very costly. But it is important to have more and more projects, cases that are successful, because if you go in a hospital and he says, no, I want to sell you an AI product, it says, no, there were 2 other companies, they sold a product, AI product, it was not working at all. They become skeptical for the next projects, for next companies that will approach. Yeah.
Indeed, yeah. So do we have anyone who's not too shy to ask a question? Otherwise, I'm going to move on to Charles. There's someone. It's Ryan, but he doesn't want to ask a question.
I think the mic, yeah. So when inevitably AI makes a mistake, who will be liable?
So I think if the question is, and I don't want to paraphrase Ryan, if the AI makes a mistake, Charles, who's to blame?
Yeah.
Well, I think back to Michael's point, even in a great example of not letting the best become the enemy of better. Right? There's one, I worked in the designing nuclear reactors. In the nuclear power industry, you look at risk, right? And actually it's one of the safest industries in the world, regardless of some of the things that have happened around the world over a couple of decades. Some of those, but when they happen, they make a lot of press. So why is it that in humans, in the studies that are done, generally have a rational fear or things they can't see, smell, or control, or hear? Your senses can't, and you're not in control of it, you irrationally fear it. The easy example, coming back to autopilot, is that you're much more likely to die driving your own car to the airport than to fly. And most people that are very uncomfortable with flying have no problem driving. So that's the adoption piece. So coming back to, is AI going to make mistakes? Compared to what? Compared to what we have today. And so when I hear us talking, we're talking about data preparation as a great example in breast cancer and being able to make accurate models. And we see the promise. here around the world in many different cases where we know they can be better, and then we're talking about what's limiting either the adoption or making it more broadly accepted.
Super, and I think there was a point about labeling, and I don't want to blow our trumpet here, but labeling, as you say, used to be the case. You need someone who's an expert to tell you what these are. And you're right, there's still an element of that. But I think we're moving away from how do you label 850 million images? You know, you can't. So you have to use an agent to do that. And there are services out there, not just from us, but from other vendors that do the labeling exercise. So thank you, Charles. Michel, in terms of the quality of the data, I think that was a theme throughout this morning. And you know, this idea of rubbish in, rubbish out, and actually, if you put it through a learning model that scales, it can actually get a lot worse. I had the privilege of sitting in a presentation formerly from MIT, and they showed that some of the simulations got really bad, and then they got much better. So there was something about using different dimensions, you know, whether you use 13 data sets or 50 and so on, and then there was a compression that showed really bad data. So to Ryan's point, I think that was you, Ryan, you have to protect the clinician, you've got to protect the professional. Mistakes do happen, you know. I've seen a Tesla crash, and I still think, and I'm not here to put my opinion forward, that it's safer to drive than many of us, you know, after a few drinks. But mistakes will happen, so you need this framework. But back to the data point, Michel, how do you go about having a data strategy, both as a company, as a startup, and as a government? Broad enough question for you? He switched it off.
Well, we only have 3 minutes left, so that's
yes, let's get to it.
We need to prolong it for half an hour. I think I have to go back to Ilja's argument here. I think one of the biggest problem is the lack of a common data standard for description of certain diseases, of description of data, etc. I remember 5-6 years ago, I was a junior resident at the University Hospital Bern, and I was drilled every single day by my chief physician on how to nicely write reports. And my days consisted 3 hours a day on writing medical letters. And then if the punctuation wasn't correct or it wasn't exactly the way she wanted it, I had to redo the whole thing. And then the boss changed and he wanted a different format. So I had to relearn how that guy wanted it. And imagine that in every department, every hospital, every country. It's a no-go. We cannot work with that.
That's a lot of waste. We've got about 2 minutes. I'm going to come to Ilja and then I'll try to wrap up. So Ilja, the idea that we're going to be dealing with a lot more data. There's a lot of data exhaust, and there's value in it, but it's hidden. Yep. How do you go about making that data valuable, having gravity in real-world situations, not just in clinical trials, where I completely agree that that's the benchmark in randomized control trials, but how do you get, out of everybody has a phone and they're collecting an awful lot. There's a lot of silos. How do you make that data more valuable?
Simple short question, ask the right question. If you ask the right question, then you proceed right afterwards. And then if you need to specialize, because we are talking about narrow AI, it's not general AI we are talking about. And the narrow AI has to be very precise, and the question that we ask also very precise. And this is the short question. It's a short answer at the time, yeah.
I think we've allowed a minute. So first of all, I want to thank my panelists. Yeah. It's been fascinating. We were trying to meet before this, and I think we definitely meet after this. Lots of intellectual capital. Grab these gentlemen if you can. Warm round of applause to them, and we'll wrap up here.